Okay, so today I want to try to introduce another concept. This concept's, I think, a little tricky. So for the last half, I'll also try to give a concrete example, which luckily enough, I've happened upon recently, and I've been in conversation with the team behind this particular concrete example, and I think it's awesome, but it's also a great example. So the concept, I'm going to use the term the transcendent operator. Now, I don't know if anybody else uses that term. I'm hoping not, because that way it's not going to be confused. But the basic idea, and I think I'm kind of maybe stealing the idea from my friend Jeff Gomez in the context of transmedia. So here's the idea. You have some kind of an object which is very abstract, and the abstraction describes the object in a way that is, in some sense, specifically its uniqueness or its characteristics, its necessary characteristics, its unique and singular characteristics, but separate from any particular actualization or an instantiation, like an instance. So in computer science, we could think of it as an object class. And then we could talk about an instance of an object class where the specific characteristics are in fact given values. In the context of transmedia, so Jeff's domain, we can think of like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you have this notion of, say, Thor. And they have a problem, which is that they need to be able to empower the director of the Avengers to make Thor, like to do Thor. And they need to empower the director of the movie Thor to do Thor. These are actually very different people with different aesthetics, different sensibilities, different stories, different requirements. And yet, of course, the character needs to be felt as being Thor, the same person, right? Continuity across distinct instantiations, distinct contexts. And so that's the object, right? The intent of a transcendent operator is to be able to create something and to enable it to have continuity uh, while also having specificity or uniqueness in distinct contexts. All right. Now, what does that mean in the context of Civium? Okay. So the notion of Civium is very, very much tied to this idea of the transcendent operator. So I'll give you an example, and then I'll tie this example to the concrete real world example that's happening. We have a transcendent operator that describes the characteristics of what I'll call the ontological design of Civium, which is to say the aspects of livingness, the physical architectural elements, things like how people living in Civium deal with problems of energy. How do they get energy? Or waste, or food, or transportation, or physical domicile, and things like that. Okay? All the different questions you have to ask to answer the problem of how do we live together in community and space. There's a set of design characteristics of what an instantiation of Civium must look like. And then what happens is you actually instantiate an actual Civium in a real context, in a real bioregion specifically. Right? So each distinct Civium will have its transcendent characteristics in common across the globe, but in particular, unique bioregions will have very specific different instantiations. Right? So if I were to instantiate a Civium in, say, the desert, and then instantiate a Civium in like Oregon, on the coast of Oregon, those are, of course, in many, many ways going to be quite different because the actual ways that they will answer questions like how do we source food and water will be different, but they'll also have a lot of similarities. And I don't mean just generically that they both will have to source food and water, but things like how do you act, what's the set of toolkits that you might bring to bear in general across all possible solutions, at least now, for enabling closed loops. And so one of the characteristics of a Civium construct is to close as many loops as possible. So there's one answer to the question of closed loops water in the desert. There's another answer to the question of closed loop water in Oregon. And both of those answers sort of take the basic toolkit and apply some of this, some of that together, and solve the problem, answer the question well. And of course, you go across the entire set of questions in a living space. So the Civium design, or in fact the transcendent design, is a problem of designing at the level of the transcendent operator in the mode of what we might call architecture or physical design, questions like energy and food, in the mode of culture, and in the mode of like socio-technology, things like governance and economics, which is not strictly the same. And I would say that culture is probably the most fundamental. So doing the transcendent operator around culture, and then the process for instantiating that in given specific actualizations is the most fundamental work. The example I'm going to give is actually an example from the level of architecture and systems design. But so let's move on to the example. Okay, so the actual real world project that I've come into contact with recently is called Oceanics. And what I'll do is I'll be using the actual concept design by the Bjarke Ingels group to help articulate the concepts. When I ran into the team at Oceanics, and I've now met with them several times, I was taken by the degree to which it really is very similar to a lot of the Civium notions, particularly if you were to imagine it as an instantiation of this Civium transcendent operator in the context of the ocean, particularly the ocean 30 degrees north and south of the equator, with a big lean towards the physical layer. So let's take a look at that. So the first thing that they did is they take a look at the whole system and the set of holistic requirements that are necessary to actually make a given instance of Oceanics complete. Right? So you have to be able to take care of food, and you have to take care of water, and at a design level, at the very high level, things like sustainability and localism and lack of waste are all, and livingness, by the way, wholesomeness, are all key values that feed into the design. And then they run a process where they take a look at how do we express these values given the limitations and the capacities of the local environment. What they do is they have what they call a kit of parts. So they took a look at each particular problem, say for example, food or energy, and then they looked through all the different possible answers to that problem, and then they took a look at which of those answers are most valid and least valid in the context both of the local environment and in the context of the larger whole. So for example, in the case of Oceanics, if you've got floating platforms in the ocean, you have access to ocean tidal power to produce electricity. Obviously, in the context of the broader Civium, if you're instantiating a Civium in the desert, you don't. But if you're instantiating it in the desert, perhaps you have the ability to rely on solar power more effectively. So now let's take a look at the structural design. And this is where my eyes were really opened in terms of the relationship between what they're doing at Oceanics and the Civium vision. They've taken what was frankly a fractal and holonic approach. Okay, so if we take a look at this basic unit, which they call a neighborhood, as you can see, it's actually designed around roughly the level of the Dunbar number. And it's designed around the ability to have a decent fraction of the whole of life happening in a given neighborhood. Right? So the neighborhood has food and water and waste and power, electricity and education and human development and vocation anchored and grounded at the neighborhood level. Then a series of neighborhoods is collected into the next fractal level up, the village. So in each transformation, each holonic level up, you have a really interesting dialogue between generality and specificity or uniqueness. So for example, any given neighborhood will have a sizable fraction of self-sufficiency. Right? It'll produce a sizable fraction of its own food, its own energy, et cetera, et cetera. But then also will have a meaningful fraction of dependence on other neighborhoods in its village and uniqueness or specificity. So in the context of a given village, for example, you may have one neighborhood that leans more heavily in the direction of, say, food. So it's kind of like the restaurant district. Another one leads more in the direction of, say, art or research and industry. And so you get this really nice tension between resilience, self-sufficiency, decoupling, and specialization and intensity, and by the way, also communication. As people, if I never leave my neighborhood, then what happens is I create a parochialism. But if I leave my neighborhood to go to another neighborhood in the same village, because they have something that my neighborhood doesn't have, then of course this creates a flow and creates a felt sense of connection. Then villages, for their part, can be connected up into cities and start getting into larger population densities. And you'll notice, by the way, at the level of the city, you also start seeing the interesting addition of stochastic or asymmetric elements, elements that are not strictly the hexagon, and that's an important aspect as well. Right? So an increase in the richness or diversity of the characteristic while also maintaining the symmetry of the primary characteristic. And of course, as you get into larger populations, the degree to which you might have, for example, a given village may have a real lean in a given direction. It's a gastronome village, or it's a village that is sort of renowned for its athletics, where the larger city now has even stronger differentiation. In principle, this construct can continue to scale. So you could get a population of Manhattan in a Civium, an Oceanics of adequate size. And what's fascinating is the actual size isn't that vast, particularly in the context of the ocean, but has a vastly better physical layout for livingness. And we'll take a look at some of the way that feels in a second. Returning back to some of the principles, you can see that we have, for example, an intent to rely as much as possible on locally sourced and either recyclable or regenerative materials, and to engage in what in the Oceanics context is what we would call regenerative agriculture or regenerative permaculture in general. Right? So we have a vision that talks about how the building out of this new way, this kind of cool, fun, interesting new concept, can also be used as a bridge to instantiate a whole bunch of values that we want to see in general. And by weaving these values together, you actually get a really meaningful chance of actualizing them in reality. So then we can look at the felt sense, the sense of livingness. And I think Engels did a great job here of creating some visual images that capture things like wholesomeness and connectedness and living in right relationship with nature. You notice, for example, that the buildings are, at least in this particular instantiation, constructed out of bamboo, and with an intent that the bamboo can be removed and replaced and regrown and delivered back into the environment, right? Closed loops everywhere you look as much as you can. And then finally, the notion of specificity, or already in the context of Oceanics, the necessity and the capacity for actualization of the transcendent operator differentially based upon different bioregions or different locations, different contexts. So for example, if you were to actualize it in the ocean, but the ocean next to or near, say, the Arab Peninsula, there's going to be one set of characteristics that will apply. And if you were to actualize it in the ocean near, say, a more northern climate country, a different set of characteristics apply. Right? And so that's that toolkit, the notion of the kit of parts, or the notion of the transcendent operator combining with the process for actualization in a given context, giving rise to events that are simultaneously specific and unique, and yet also have a felt sense of continuity with each other. So that's a sense of this notion of the transcendent operator and its actualization in a given context, obviously in the context of the ocean for Oceanics. And you can imagine that same basic process applied in other bioregions. Right? You can imagine it being applied in the desert. You can apply it in Cascadia. You could apply it in the equatorial rainforests, etc. And in each case, the point, or at least the hope of the Civium model, is that there would be a very important local distinctness. Right? There's a real difference coming up from the local environment. Local materials, the local characteristics that have constraints like sun and rain and whatnot, and yet also a very distinct sense of sameness and continuity, right? So that a given civium would have a sense of translatability and connectedness with any other given civium while maintaining that distinct sense of difference and the creative gradient that results. And one other takeaway of this particular presentation is the possibility, like the potential. Oceanics it's a real project, and frankly, it can be done. Like it's really a matter of financing, and frankly, not that much financing to build a neighborhood, right, for the very first time ever. And then, of course, once they've built the first neighborhood, you can start building the second, and the third, and the fourth, and begin to replicate it. And it really, really pushes the bar in terms of the kinds of livingness we can create. I mean, the ability to deal with a lot of the problems that we want to deal with. Problems like, well, for example, just waste or energy. How do we produce the food we want? And also problems of community and culture, and how do we actually live more real, grounded, wholesome, humane lives. There's a lot of pent-up possibility, right? The reality is that one of the reasons why Civium is ripe is we've been sitting on an old construct. These sort of 19th century cities grossed up and hypertrophied by virtue of the technologies of the 20th and 21st century. There's like a stretched rubber band, and if we just pop into a new model with these smart villages constructed in this fractal and holonic structure, there's a lot of possibility that we can leap to. We can leapfrog into a very distinct space.